Welcome. Thank you for taking your time, joining a session on drivers, and drivers. We will not be talking about how to develop drivers, but we will talk about how to get them working in your environment. We'll be focused on the most commonly used platforms today, and that's Microsoft Deployment Toolkit 2012, which was announced today. And we will also use the Config Manager platform as well for drivers. So I'm Johan. This is obviously Deployment Father Michael. And we will be your hosts for the next hour or so.
Yeah, so we want to take you through kind of an overview of the challenges of driver management, what we call the driver babble. Why are drivers so hard? Let's talk about some of the challenges that we'll run into, and then dig into the tools that will help simplify that. So what can we do first to help you download those drivers and get them to a point where they can be used by the tools? And then how do we make the tools do what you may need to do inside of your own environments? So that's what we want to focus on. And we'll go through all of that, and hopefully at the end have time for Q&A as well, so that we can answer any questions that hopefully get raised in your minds as we're talking about this, because it's not so much going to be a definitive, you must do this type of discussion. It's going to be more about, here are the options that, depending on what you want to do, you may need to make different decisions than the person sitting next to you. So we want to explain what the different options are, and then talk about some of the ways that you can combine those and use them in your own environment.
That's the right session code, right?
CDB336. I have no idea how the hashtags work out for such a weird session
that's
ID.
The one. Questions, we love them. Keep them coming. We won't be able to answer them all throughout the session, but I'm keeping sort of a look at the feed here. But if we can't answer them here, we will make sure to answer them afterwards. So we love questions. Sorry, Michael.
Okay. So let's dive in and talk about just the general challenges as we get started. First, there are multiple packaging mechanisms. Every vendor out there wants to package a driver differently. All we really want are the raw driver files, the INFs, the sys files, the DLLs, the stuff that you actually need to give to Windows to tell it to install a driver. But instead of getting that, we get cab files, zip files, executables, installers, every possible packaging mechanism imaginable. So the first challenge then is, how do you get the real driver out of that? So we'll talk about that some and look at some of the tools that are available to help with that. So that's the first round of challenges to get past. Unfortunately, that's one of the easier ones, so we can show you how to help with that, but then we get into some of the more challenging issues around the applications that go with the drivers. Like if you're installing an NVIDIA video driver, you need the app that goes along with it to get the NVIDIA control panel, or issues like that. How do you address those types of challenges as well to install the software that goes along with it? That becomes especially problematic with things like Bluetooth drivers and 4G wireless cards and things that have very specific software requirements on top of the drivers themselves. So there's another round of challenges. We also have the fun vendors who decide that they want to release a new version of a driver to support new devices, and at the same time remove old devices from the same driver files. So now I had to have 3 or 4 or 5 different versions of the same driver to support all the different models of machines into my environment. That's not necessarily that bad, but how do we enable the tools to have multiple versions of the driver available at one time? So we have to deal with that. We need to deal with badly formed drivers. The most common problem that we run into are drivers that have INFs that say they support a particular platform, and they don't. So you download a driver that says it's x86 and x64, you try to deploy it to an x86 machine, it works fine. You try to deploy it to an x64 machine, it blue screens. That's not a very good experience for the end user. So we need to be able to figure out then, what does this driver really support? So what can we do to help with that process? There are also then the two-tier drivers, which are kind of a special case where one driver installs based on plug-and-play enumeration, and after that one driver installs, now additional devices show up. That can present some challenges when we're talking about enumerating plug-and-play devices to detect what's needed, because we only see the initial plug-and-play ID. We don't see the second set of plug-and-play IDs that show up after the first one arrives. So how do you deal with those types of devices? That becomes a challenge as well. Fortunately, things have improved over the last few years. When we started talking about this back in 2010, there was a brand new development at the time, which were the Dell driver cab files. How many of you have used those cab files? That's pretty impressive. That was to simplify the first challenge on the list. We just want a cab file or a zip file or something that contains the raw drivers. Now, over the last 6 months to a year, the other vendors have started to finally release those. So HP, Lenovo, and others have made available the raw driver files. Not universally, but they're getting better about adding them for the new models as they come out. So that's at least going to simplify the first challenge somewhat. They do have some additional tools that come into that as well that Johan will walk through. So there is some hope. The OEMs are improving. They're recognizing that enterprises have some unique requirements, and we can provide drivers and tools that can help with that. So let me turn it over to Johan to talk about those rounds of challenges around finding drivers.
So, which one was mine? Number 4?
3, I believe.
Let's go 3.
Yep.
Looks like mine. All right. So Michael mentioned that OEMs are actually improving, and they do. It's not perfect. It's not. But it's well on the way of getting you some really good tools to help you find the drivers. So where in all do you start? Well, I like sort of WordPad. When you start finding drivers, you need to start with the vendor. That's your primary choice of finding a driver, because that will be the only driver that will actually be supported by that vendor. So if you buy a Dell, go to Dell. If you buy an HP, go to HP, and you understand the drill. However, what do you do when you can't find that driver at the vendor site? And you still need to get that hardware going, and at that point you may be realizing, okay, I don't get support, I just want it working. Fine. So where do you go? Well, you have to go to the vendor's vendor. And what I mean by that is, for example, if this laptop has an Intel NIC card in it, fine, go to Intel and get that driver. It has a Broadcom card, get Broadcom. NVIDIA, get NVIDIA. But that's your second choice. You should always start with the vendor. And what if you can't find it at the vendor's vendor site? You don't even know what hardware device it is. Well, actually, Microsoft can help. The Microsoft catalog has, I don't know how many tons of gigs, but lots of drivers in there. And you can search for them. You can search for them by name and by plug-and-play ID number. And sometimes that can help you locate what type of device this is, and then you can go back to the vendor or the vendor's vendor site and try to find the driver. Or you can even get the driver from Microsoft directly and download it from there. So to give you an example, Michael mentioned HP. So HP has their SoftPack Download Manager, where you can quickly navigate through most of their models and pick an OS, pick a language, and you can say find available drivers for it. They call it SoftPacks. And when you do that, you will get a view in the right-hand corner where all the available drivers for that particular model, for that particular OS. But what's happening quite recently now is that, let me find that one for you. Did I miss it? Here we go. They have started to do what Dell did. They provide you with combo packs, ready-made packs for a few sets of laptops. And they also get you the drivers for the actual boot image now, for Windows PE. And that can be used both in Config Manager and both in Light Touch. And if you want to know more about what that pack is supporting for model, you can say, all right, give me the information about it, the CVA. So you right-click, and you go CVA. And then you'll see a sort of a README file eventually, shortly. It's coming. Here we go. And now I can say, all right, this particular package with drivers is supporting the following models. And then you can get them in one piece and download them all, instead of going audio, video, NIC, and all that way. So they have done a pretty good job recently on developing this tool. And when you download them, you can say download, or you can say download and unpack, extract them. And it will be extracted in the file system, in the folder that you select, and they'll be in a folder like this. So as you can see, it doesn't do the download per model. It will just download them all together at once. So what I normally do, I do package or model, and then I move the stuff out of here to a folder structure. And then I go next model. So I go model by model here. If you go to the Dell site, for example, they have their cab files. Same way, you can get the cab file for WinP, and you can get the per system cab file, or you can get the combo cab file. So they have a cab file for all their laptops and all their desktops in a single package that you can add. I normally do model by model, but if you don't have too many models, fine. You can go with a big package as well. That's OK. If you look into Lenovo, they have their update retriever utility, which unfortunately doesn't work very well on server 8, which I'm running as my host here. Oh, sorry, server 2012, that I'm running as my host here. So I'm running this one on 2008 R2. So the update retriever, you add a model, and when you add a model in here, you can't type the model number that you actually had. You need to type only the first 4 characters of the model number. So if you want the ThinkPad 420, you type in the first 4 characters of ThinkPad 420, you select the OS, and you select the language. And in terms of drivers, go English, no matter where you are in the world. The drivers is not different because my laptop is bought in Sweden. Doesn't happen. So after selecting a device, clicking Next, it will start scan for drivers, download them, and or give you an option to download them shortly. I think it's all the tweeting that is consuming the bandwidth here. Let me see. I have a question. What websites are the cab files located for Lenovo models? Well, this is the utility. So you go to the Lenovo website, you search for update retriever, and there you get it. You can browse to the site and go model by model as well as you always could, but this allows you to do many at a time. So you clip the drivers you want and you download them, fine. But then to get them in an unpacked format, you go to your repository and you export them. You specify a folder and you hit next and off you go. So let me see if I can select an existing folder here. Select the drivers you want, select the models you want, and they will be exported into an unpacked format. So pretty much like the SoftPack Download Manager, but this is the Lenovo-style version of it instead. If we go to the catalog site, the Microsoft catalog site, for example, if you have a device, you're not really sure what this is. Well, it's the Intel stuff, I know that, but maybe you don't. You can actually go to the device, find the details, find the hardware ID of that device, and you can search for those device IDs directly on the catalog site. Or if you want to verify that you have a new version of the display driver, you can do the same thing. You can go Properties, find the device ID, copy it, paste it, clean it out a little bit, leave out the revision number in the end, so you actually only do the vendor and the device ID. There's no point of looking for revisions. you won't get that many back. And then all right, to get a few versions of this, in particular NVIDIA driver, and you can see you have for Windows 7, you have for Windows 8, and you have a bunch of drivers. And sometimes the newest driver, it's not the solution. Sometimes you need to go back to an older version to get the stuff going again. And the beauty of this site is that you get all the history, etc., in one place. And these are certified drivers as well. But again, your first place should be the vendor site. This is, well, useful. You can also go to the good old, it's been around for many years, the PCIdatabase.com, where you can search for a particular vendor or a particular device ID and get some information back about what you are dealing with. It won't get you any drivers, but it will get you information about the device. So quite useful. It's not perfect, but it's a good start. I got another question here about the HP and Dell cabs or packages. Are they good enough? Sort of. They will give you like a 90–95% head start. But you still need to clean out junk in them. I will give you an example. If I download the drivers pack for this HP 8540 that I have, it will download the Intel NIC driver for this one. And in that Intel NIC driver package, there are Windows 7 drivers, there are Windows Vista drivers, and there are Windows XP drivers. And guess what? If you get the XP drivers into your boot image by accident or into your OS by accident and you're deploying Windows 7, it will not work. So sometimes you need to delete a few of the unwanted drivers. But I'd rather do that 5% than to do everything manual. So to answer the questions, I think they're good enough to start with. It really helps. It will save you hours and hours. And they are still improving every day. You will see new versions all the time. You can also go to the Dell FTP site as well. However, they did something recently. I didn't quite get why, but they did. Most of the packages is also available in the sysman folder here. You can download them directly. You can do them many at a single time. But recently, they actually started to put them into these folders here that are named weird names. So you have to look them up on the website, and then you can download multiple at the same time. It's OK if you have 5 to go to the website, click, click, click. But if you have like 25, well, I can just schedule a job here, and I go for coffee. Life is good. All right. Back to Michael.
OK. All right, so getting the drivers, first challenge. We had to go to the vendors, we had to download them, we had to extract them. Next round of challenges really have more to do with the types of hardware that you need to support. A typical enterprise might have maybe 20, 30 different models of machines that they need to support if it's a good enterprise. If it's a really bad enterprise and they go out and buy 100 PCs at a time, whatever's cheapest, whatever they can get a good bid on, they might need to support hundreds of models of machines. So having that constantly changing list of supported hardware means that you, as a deployment guy, have a lot of work to do. Every time a new model comes in.
What's your record?
Record?
High record.
I don't know that I've seen a count of models, but I've seen a driver database, the file system size that was so large it didn't fit on a single DVD. So it was around 12 gig of just drivers. And that was after they went through and cleaned them all up. So they had gone through what you had described and removed all the duplicates and got rid of all the ones that they didn't need. So you can run into enterprises that have hundreds of models. Headaches. That would be the real world, worst case type of scenario that you need to run into. So obviously, you can make your life much easier just by convincing your enterprise that you need to buy larger batches of machines, standardize on particular models, and get it to the point where you only need to support a few dozen That is really easy if you're using the standard enterprise class machines. Dell, HP, Lenovo, Toshiba, there are a variety of standard enterprise vendors out there that release machines that at least don't change day to day. They're fairly consistent over a long period of time. So you don't have to worry too much about the machines that came in today versus the machines that come in next week having completely different hardware inside of them. But if you go for the cheapest possible machines out there and go for the configuration of the day vendors who have the white box type machines that are assembled with whatever parts they could get cheapest that week, you will never be able to solve this whole driver management challenge. You'll always have missing drivers, missing devices, and you'll constantly be downloading drivers and trying to get them hooked into your environment. So that perfect environment for me would be an enterprise that goes out and replaces every single PC at one time with, say, a desktop model, a laptop model, a workstation model, and keeps every one of those machines for 3 to 4 years, depending on your hardware refresh cycle, because that is perfect. You only need to worry about certifying those models. It's really easy. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen too much. Most enterprises out there can't handle the financials of doing that, of replacing every single PC at once. So they do more of a rolling upgrade cycle of replacing every month, every quarter, once a year, twice a year. The less frequent you can do that, the better off you're going to be, because as a result, you're going to end up with fewer models in your overall inventory to worry about. If you're the type that are ordering monthly, try to talk your enterprise into going quarterly. If you order quarterly, try to talk them into semi-annually. If you're doing semi-annual, try to do annual. Try to get that list of models down to something manageable. At the very least, try to maintain some consistency around chipsets and processor types. If you have machines coming in, some of which are Intel-based, some of which are AMD-based, they're going to have completely different driver sets, more or less guaranteed. When vendors change from one version of a chipset to the next version of a chipset, that's pretty much guaranteed to cause a wholesale change in the drivers that are being supported. So anything that you can do around keeping the consistency in the chipsets and keeping the consistency in the processor types will help you out as well. Vendors like Intel tend to have chipsets that stay around for enterprises for a period of about 18 months. So as you're buying machines over that 18-month period, you can pretty much guarantee that they're going to be fairly stable. There may be a new video driver, a new NIC, a new something that gets added into the mix that requires that you add maybe one more driver to the mix. But you're not going to have to revisit the whole set. When those chipset switchovers happen, though, which tends to be once or twice a year, and you start ordering those new models of machines, you're going to have to expect a fair amount of work to go through and identify the drivers for those. This whole discussion really ties more into that infrastructure optimization. Really, it was something that Microsoft was real keen on a couple of years ago, telling everyone that this is a best practice to optimize your infrastructure, to reduce your costs, to get consistency and standardization. And it resonated pretty well, but as the marketing is shifted to private cloud and everything else, it's kind of fallen off the radar to a certain extent. So if you haven't read through some of the infrastructure optimization guides talking about ways that you can reduce your costs by increasing the standardization, definitely look those up and check them out. So then we had to talk about approaches. And this is one of those where Johan and I have argued over the years. And
just a little bit.
It's kind of a continuum that we have two different ends of the continuum. We can let the tool decide. Let's take all the drivers that we need for every device and just import them all and let the system figure it out. So we'll do the plug and play enumeration. We'll identify what drivers are needed. We'll download them all to the machine, and we'll tell Windows, here they are, install what you want. We then leave it up to Windows to pick the best driver for the device in the cases where that where it detected 5 or 6 or 7 different drivers and downloaded them all. Well, Windows is only going to install one of them, so which one's it going to pick? There is a whole driver ranking process that's described in excruciating detail on MSDN that you can read through and probably predict which one of those it's going to install. But most of the time, people would just say, I don't care as long as it works. So that's kind of the chaos side of the world. Let's just import everything and hope it works.
And then here's the deal. By using technologies that are based on plug-and-play ID, it actually are things that will not be detected by that. For example, if you have attached a phone or a scanner or something to the device and it's not turned on, well, Windows will not find it through plug-and-play. If you have a smart card reader in your HP laptop and you did not put in the smart card when you deploy that machine, well, plug-and-play may not detect that card and may not install the driver. So when the user finally gets this SD card from their camera, inject it, Windows don't have a driver for it. So
you can probably tell which side of the fence he will argue for. It is chaos. I mean, if you really want this to work, of being able to throw all the drivers together and let the system or Windows figure out which ones to install, you better have a pretty good lab environment. Because every time you add a new driver into the mix, you run the risk of breaking not the machine you added the driver for, because you test that one out and you find that one right away. You might break 3 other models of machines that you bought 2 years ago. So in order for this to really be effective, you need to have one of every model in a lab where you can run a regression test, if you're familiar with Microsoft testing terms, just to redeploy an OS to every single machine in your lab and make sure that all the drivers install. Certainly doable. I've seen customers who have that type of environment that they can just easily push the button, redeploy Windows 7 with all new drivers to every single machine in their lab, having rack upon rack of reference hardware to do this deployment to. And in that case, this can work fairly well. But in the cases where you don't have that, if you don't have one of every model of machines, well, you're going to run into issues. There will be drivers that work well on one particular model, but if you install them on another, video might not work, or you might get a non-standard resolution, or worst case, you might even get a blue screen, depending on the different types of driver issues that you run into. So, and you can go to the other end of the spectrum, and you can say, I want to explicitly control every driver that gets installed on every machine based on some criteria that I define. At the very least, I want to control the drivers based on OS. So if I'm deploying XP, I want to use this driver set. If I'm deploying Windows 7, I want to use this driver set. But I might need to take that even further. For this Dell machine, I want to use this set. For this HP machine, I want to use a different set. For every single model machine in my environment, I will build a list of drivers to install for that machine. That's the control freak side of the world. I really want to know exactly what driver is going to be installed to eliminate all the guesswork and to eliminate all the testing that could happen anytime you add a new driver into the mix. Because if you add a new driver, you're adding it for a specific model. You don't need to worry about it affecting any other model.
And I normally start with that model. I've been using that for years and years, trying to figure out an identifier for a given hardware model or classification type and make sure I deploy a fixed set of drivers to that machine, no matter what the machine thinks about it or not. I'm just saying these drivers goes to that model. And I did that rigorously until I went to Chicago last year, when I got to a customer and we started to deal with drivers, and they gave me the list of models. 296. And I'm like, all right, we are not going model by model. We are going chaos for some of it. So we did the 20 most common models they had, and then we just created a giant package for the rest and hope for the best. There was no way we would be even able to get the machines to test the drivers on. And they had like 3, 4, 5 of them. This was a research company, scientists building their own stuff. They had hardware I did not know exists. Yes, sir.
One argument for chaos approach, big fan of it. So basically, Windows comes with that approach. They just certify drivers and put it in a vanilla image, and they don't do any.
Yeah, so the comment up front was that Windows kind of operates in chaos mode, that when you take a Windows CD and install Windows onto a new piece of hardware, it has a driver database embedded within the Windows media, and it will find the best matching driver and install it. That works well for Windows because Windows can delegate the responsibility for making sure that works out to all the OEMs. So the OEMs are providing the drivers that get put into Windows and certifying that they will work well, and they will work for every supported model of machine from that vendor. So they're really shifting the burden away from Microsoft to the OEMs to support that. When you start doing that in your environment, you're taking that responsibility back on yourself. So if you're willing to do that and do the testing and do the verification to make sure it all works, it can work.
One comment on verification. It's really sometimes not worth it. You basically can go really reactive in this case. The cases when the new driver breaks existing machines happens comparatively rarely, and you can really go reactive and have a process in place where you can easily exclude the new drivers from applying to the machines.
Yeah, so the point made was that you can use chaos proactively and retest everything every time you add a new driver to make sure you didn't break anything, or you can be reactive about it and just wait for something to break and then try to fix it. So you can do that. I mean, you've had the same discussions around app compat testing and other things where you can just say, well, I will accept the fact that I'm going to have 10% of my machines with issues. I'll just send someone out to fix them, and
It's about
it
the
saves
balance.
trouble. So yeah, it becomes a question of where do you want to spend your effort, where do you want to spend your time. Another case, just to not to argue Johan's point too much, but another issue that I've seen is mouse drivers. Sounds like a really simple thing that mouse drivers should be easy. And if you have something like a USB mouse that plugs into the typical USB port, hey, it is simple. But get PS2 mice and try to get the right PS2 mouse driver to install on a machine. If you have a Microsoft PS2 mouse and 3 other brands of PS2 mice, they all have the same plug-and-play ID. How are you going to get the right driver to install? You're not. And then you start getting the phone calls from people who say, the buttons on the side of my mouse don't work. The mouse itself works. I can left-click, I can right-click, the scroll wheel will probably be okay, but all the extra features, they won't work.
Well, isn't it about time you actually show us how to get this working?
Yeah, just one more point to make is that there's probably some place in between. Like Johan was saying before, maybe you can do chaos for some devices, for some models, for some machines. You can be a control freak on other models. You can do mix and match. So as we're going through and talking about the different approaches, we want to talk about kind of the hybrid scenarios as well and look to see where's that happy medium. What can we do to set this up so that we can reduce the amount of effort that we spend on it and get a reliable result at the same time? So a little bit more talk before we switch over to doing more demos. Boot images get to be a little special. In order to deploy Windows, we need Windows PE with the necessary NIC and storage drivers. If you're deploying Windows XP still, hopefully you're well on your way to moving to Windows 7, but if you're using Windows PE 3.0, which is what MDT and Config Manager both use at this point, you'll need Windows 7 drivers for those boot images. So at the very least, you'll need to be working with the Windows 7 NIC and storage drivers, and for whatever other operating systems, that you then need all the drivers. So then let's talk about light touch. We'll go through MDT without Config Manager initially and look at the ways that we can do driver management there. So first, let's talk some about terminology. We have a driver share, or a deployment share in MDT that holds all the drivers that we're looking to deploy. So you import drivers into that deployment share. You can then arrange them into folders. You can then create selection profiles to group those folders together. And then as part of the deployment process, there's an injection process that takes all of the identified drivers, filtered based on selection profiles and folders and supported platforms and plug-and-play IDs and all that kind of stuff, and it injects them into the operating system. So the whole setup is designed to be dynamic. Same would be true with Configuration Manager as well, where we can do kind of a rules-based process to help control this. We've provided some additional customization capabilities in MDT where we can set different task sequence variables during the process to make it even more dynamic. We'll look at how that fits into the process too. So let me switch over and let's just start walking through some scenarios.
There we go.
Okay. So like every good deployment guy, if you're going to any MDT sessions this week, ask them to show you what version of MDT they're running. 6.0.2223.0 RTM, released today. So if you create a deployment share inside of MDT, it's nothing more than a file share where MDT arranges all the drivers on the system. So the first task that you would typically go through is you would start importing some drivers. So let me import some just to show what that looks like. I don't want to import too many of them. So I downloaded the HP Windows PE driver set earlier just because it's a reasonable size set of drivers, mostly NIC and mass storage because that's what's needed in Windows PE. And I can import those. And all that's really doing is MDT goes through, looks at every INF file, figures out what all these drivers are, and arranges them inside of the deployment share so that we can figure out what's what. So it's basically building a catalog of everything that's there. Now, as we're going through that, you can see a few warnings. Like in this case, it says, warning, driver Intel SCSI adapter does not appear to support platform x86 as indicated, overriding. So we looked at the INF for this particular driver, and it said it supported x86 and x64. But when we actually looked at the driver files, the sys files, the DLLs, and everything else, we couldn't find any x86 files. We could only find x64 files. As a result, it's pretty safe to say that this driver doesn't support x86. So we'll uncheck the supported platform to make sure we never inject that driver into the wrong platform. That was a feature that we added into MDT 2010 Update 1 just to make sure that we didn't run into blue screens because we tried to deploy the wrong driver to the wrong machine. Now in this case, it found duplicate drivers. So in this, here we can see a couple of cases where it didn't add a driver because it was already in the folder. So we have what's considered an optimized set of drivers from HP to support all their models of machines in Windows PE, and yet they still have duplicates. Now, if we were to do this with a larger driver cab file from HP, Dell, whoever, you'll see lots of these cases where you will import these drivers and we'll filter out all the duplicates as we're going through. Because we want to keep the driver set as small as possible. So as we're going through and importing them, all of them get checksummed, all of them get verified to make sure that we never pull in the same driver twice. We don't want to have duplicates out there. Config Manager has similar logic as it's going through there as well. We'll look at some of the enhancements later with Config Manager 2012 to see how it better handles these import challenges too. So I have the drivers here at this point, and we can see the different details about them just to see the types of things that we've imported. We know what platforms are supported. We have a list of all the plug-and-play IDs that are supported, and just different information about these devices that are used during the deployment process. So In chaos mode, we would just keep doing this. We'd just keep importing and importing and importing and importing, and this list would get to be huge. So that's the first scenario. I have another deployment chair here where that's pretty much exactly what I've done. I've downloaded a whole bunch of cab files, a whole bunch of HP soft packs, extracted the contents of those, imported them in, and okay, I'm now ready to deploy. Might work, might not work, might need to do some troubleshooting, might need to do some cleaning up to get rid of things that aren't really needed, but it's a good starting point. Now, as far as the task sequences go, I don't have to do anything special. I have one for Windows 7, one for Windows XP. And if we look at the pre-install configuration, I just have a default inject driver step that says I want to use all drivers and to install only matching drivers from the selection profile. So we'll do plug-and-play detection, and out of all the drivers that are available, inject the ones that match. Same thing applies to the boot images. So we have our Windows PE properties. We say we want to inject all drivers that are network or mass storage into this boot image. That starts to get a little interesting. So if we were to look at the class of driver here, if I sort by class, scan through the list, anything HDC is a mass storage driver, so I've got quite a few of those. Anything net is a network driver, got quite a few of those. Anything SCSI adapter is also a mass storage driver. So all of those devices will get injected into my Windows PE image. I really don't have that many models of devices in here, yet I'm probably going to inject another 40 or 50 models, or 40 or 50 drivers into my boot image. My boot image might have started at, say, 120 meg, and by the time I got done injecting all of those, it might now be up to 160. That's not a sustainable model. Eventually, your Windows PE image is going to get too big because you've got too many different versions of too many different drivers, so you're going to have to start filtering down the list of drivers that you inject like that. So there's the first downside of total chaos, is your boot images might get too big. Plus, we've got the challenges around some of the drivers might not work. We could run into blue screens, those types of things. But if you do enough testing and verification and have a reasonable size environment, it can work. So then let's try to do something a little more organized. So we have a slightly larger environment. Maybe they have a few more models of machines that they need to support. And still supporting multiple operating systems in Windows PE. So at this point, we can say we want to group our drivers a little bit more. So we can create folders inside of MDT. I can create one and put in only the Windows PE drivers that I want. So here I've got a much smaller list than what we were looking at before. I can then build a list of all the Windows XP drivers that I want to use for XP task sequences, and all the Windows 7 drivers that I want to use when I'm deploying Windows 7. Now for my boot images, I can reconfigure Windows PE to say I only want to use the drivers from the Windows PE selection profile. So I skipped a step there. If we look under Advanced Configuration Selection Profiles, I've created one for each of those folders where the selection profile just says select only the drivers in that folder. So in this case, Windows PE selects Windows PE, Windows 7 selects Windows 7, and Windows XP selects Windows XP, obviously. So on the boot image side, I specify Windows PE, and then in each of the task sequences, I can specify on the inject driver step to only consider the drivers from that particular selection profile. So now I've got tight control over what's in Windows PE, which is good, keeps my Windows PE boot image down. I don't have to worry too much about that. And I can at least separate the Windows 7 drivers from the Windows XP drivers to make sure I use the right driver set for each. So that's better, but it's still going to be chaos after that point. Of all those Windows 7 drivers, we're going to find all the matches and then let Windows pick one. So if you wanted to take it further, you would have to get a little bit more involved. So let's look at this structure. First, let's break it down by architecture. I mean, the OSs are usually smart enough to figure out x86 versus x64, but just for organization's sake, we can separate them.
I love this.
We can then break them down by operating system, like we had before, and then by model. This is where this gets to be a little more interesting, because now we can populate each of these folders with only the drivers to support that particular model. So for x86 Windows 7, I have a list of folders there. For Windows XP, I have a list of folders. For Windows PE, no folders because, well, I'm just going to have Windows PE drivers in general. For x64, same basic setup. I have Windows 7 by model, Windows XP by model. So we have more models now than actually fit on the screen. It's just a huge number of models that need to be supported. And if you look at your typical environment, that's just getting started, most likely. When I went through and started creating these folders, start at the top, create x64, run through the wizard, next, next, next. Okay, I have one folder. Create the next level underneath it, next, next, next. Okay, I have two folders. After doing that about 10 times, oh, this is for the birds. Give me PowerShell. So I get into PowerShell and create a PowerShell script. I think I've still got that around here somewhere. And just manually edited a PowerShell script to simplify this whole process.
If you search the internet for PowerShell is king and the word MDT altogether, you'll find a script like this. Some idiot wrote it.
Yeah, and somewhere along the line, Zoom It stopped working for me.
I had that a few times. If you just close the process and start it again, it works. It's a Zoom It feature.
Take care of that in a little bit. So if we can just tell it we want to create folders. There's the first half of the challenge. Now I need to actually populate each one of those folders, though, which means going in and importing drivers into each one of those. So you probably need to have a reasonably well-organized file share behind the scenes that you use as your definitive driver library that you use to import into MDT or into Config Manager. Keep these drivers organized to make this import process reasonably easy to do. If you're really into PowerShell, you can automate it completely to the point of you create a folder structure in the file system that matches the folder structure here, and just run a PowerShell script, and it creates folders that are missing, it imports drivers into those folders, it makes sure that everything's nice and tidy, and you don't have to spend hours going through and doing this yourself. If you're trying to do this, like if Johan's going into a new customer and trying to do this for 50 different models of machines, and they have everything ready to go when he gets there, still, it could be a couple of days just going through and importing drivers.
Doesn't happen. I carry one of these.
You carry your own driver library with you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so if there's ever any doubt about what kind of value you can get out of bringing in a consultant to help jumpstart you with a deployment project, consultants carry driver libraries with them, so yeah, it's useful. If you're not going to do that kind of mass, let's get everything ready at once, and you're just going to build this up over time, I'm going to do one model today, I'm going to do another model next week, I'm going to do another model the week after that, then okay, manually doing it's not that bad, but if you're going to try to do it faster than that, you want to try to run some automation. So okay, I've got this folder structure, I've gone through and did the import drivers in each one of these, pointing at either the downloaded INF extracted files or the cab files directly. MDT understands cab files can contain drivers, so it automatically extracts the contents of the cab file and then inspects them, looking for any other driver files that are in there, and imports them. There's also a tweak that Dell put into their cab files to change the behavior for Config Manager. They put a file in each folder to make sure that the checksums never matched between each folder, because they wanted each driver to be kept separate for the kind of the control freak side of the world. So we added logic specifically in MDT for the Dell cab files to look for that file and ignore it. So when we checksum the driver, we see that the checksum is actually the same between these drivers, ignoring that uniqueness file that they put in there.
You can take it to the next level. Just ignore everything that's not referenced in the INF.
Ignore everything that's not referenced in the INF? Yeah, that would have been a little bit more work. So we just did the simple approach, which is the same approach that Config Manager uses of checksumming everything in the folder structure, even if it's not referenced by the INF. It might not be used, but we're not going to take any chances. We're going to checksum the whole thing. If you've ever looked at WDS and how it manages drivers, it does it the way that you're describing. It just looks at the INF, but we checksum the whole folder. So we do ignore that extra del file to make sure that we don't get extra duplicates in here to keep things nice and tidy and small. So I've imported all the drivers into those. Now I need to be able to tell MDT what to use when. So back on the deployment share properties, for the boot images, again, it's fairly simple. I've created a Windows PE selection profile and told it to only include drivers of the following type. Now, if I'm tightly controlling what's in that folder, I don't need to tell MDT only inject network and mass storage drivers. Maybe there are some system class drivers in there that I want to inject. Maybe there's a mouse driver that I want to inject. I don't know. So it's fairly safe in this mode to say, inject them all, because I put them there. I want them to be injected. So not a big risk there to say I want to inject all drivers. Same thing for x64. I can say to inject all drivers. Now, because I actually have two different Windows PE folders here, my selection profile looks a little different. If I look at the Windows PE selection profile, I've selected both of the Windows PE folders. MDT itself is smart enough not to inject an x64 driver into an x86 boot image or the other way around, so I didn't need to go through and create two selection profiles, but I could have if I wanted to. So that's the easy part. I get Windows PE with the right drivers based on what I put into those folders. Now I need to configure the task sequences. This is where it gets a little bit more interesting. So I've modified the inject driver step to say, use the selection profile called nothing. Well, what do you think is in the selection profile called nothing? Nothing. That's an obvious one. Basically, it's a selection profile that includes no folders. Why? Well, that ties back to this previous step, which I've added into this task sequence to say set a task sequence variable called driver group 001 to a path of a folder that I want to add to the selection profile that I've selected. So nothing plus a folder equals the folder. If I left it at the default, which is all drivers plus a folder is still all drivers. That didn't buy me anything, but by saying nothing plus a folder, I get just that folder. Then I can dynamically build the path. So in this case, I have an x86 task sequence, so I should probably say I want x86. And I want Windows 7 because I'm deploying Windows 7, and I want to use the model that MDT has already detected for the machine and select that particular folder. So that way I don't need to create a selection profile for every model of machine. Instead, I can just say I want to use this explicit folder. So at that point, I really don't even need to say install only matching drivers. I could say install all drivers because, again, I put the drivers into that folder for this model. I don't care if they're detected or not. Just go ahead and inject them. That can handle the cases like printers or scanners or other devices that might not be turned on. The drivers get injected anyway. And that ties into some of the hybrid scenarios that we'll talk about too. So I can configure that. Now, if you've ever actually done this, you'd probably recognize the flaws in this right away. What model string gets detected on a Lenovo laptop? It's a 7-character string, starts with 4 numbers, and then includes 3 random characters at the end based on the configuration that was ordered that particular day. So to figure out the model where I want a folder called something like ThinkPad W500, using 1, 2, 3, 4 ABC or 1, 2, 3, 4 DEF or 1, 2, 3, 4 FGH doesn't really help me any because I don't want to build folders for each of those Lenovo strings. So that's where people end up doing model aliasing. If you've looked at the deployment guys blog, they have a blog entry out there that runs a VB script that just goes through a bunch of rules and sets another variable called model alias to a more friendly name that you can then use instead of the model value in here to deal with those extra gotchas. Lenovo uses the weird characters. HP, some of their models, they have a bad habit of putting dates in parentheses at the end of the model strings. That doesn't work so well. Some of them have extra characters in them, null characters in them. There's all kinds of weird things that you run into when you try to do this in a live environment. So by using a model alias script to kind of scrub through all those models, you could then put in something like, instead of %model, you can put %model alias %, and we'll substitute in the value determined by that script. So to add that script in is fairly simple. You can download it from the Deployment Guys blog on the TechNet blogs, add it into your scripts folder for MDT on your deployment share or the toolkit package for config manager, hook it into custom settings to tell MDT to execute it, and it will then set this additional variable based on what it's inspected out of WMI.
It basically normalizes your model names into something useful.
Yeah, and we've looked at this over the years and said, well, it would be nice if we could kind of include something like this that was more algorithmic, that the user didn't need to tweak, but there's just too many exceptions. There's just too many things that could change that could cause the code that we put together to not work anymore, so it's easier to just keep it as a script, and if you want to tweak it, yeah, you just edit the script to put in your exceptions. We've seen weird things with white box Intel machines that have models that say insert model here or some weird text like that. So, okay, if we see one of those, we can change it to Intel white box or something like that. So there are all kinds of exceptions that you can run into. So I've edited my Windows 7 x86 task sequence to say I want to use those. I've modified the inject driver step to inject all. Same thing for Windows XP. I have a step in here to say set driver group 001 to x86. Man, I can't type. Should be Windows XP, model. I can put model alias.
How about actually typing in the driver group as well?
Yeah. Can you tell I wasn't very awake this morning? Driver group 001. So that is the same type of process then that I would set up for each of my task sequences. Some people have done that through customsettings.ini, specifying a dynamic driver group 001 path, but that gets a little challenging with light touch deployments because you don't know at the time customsettings.ini is processed which task sequence you're going to select. And if you don't know which task sequence you're going to select, you don't know which OS you're going to deploy. So how do you build a dynamic path that includes the OS and platform? So it's better to just do it as a step in the task sequence to avoid those types of challenges. Now, we talked a little bit about hybrid scenarios. So let's assume that I've done all of this and everything looks reasonably good to me, and I can deploy to those models of machines, but there are other drivers out there that I might need on machines because people might go out and buy custom hardware and put it into a PCI slot or have USB attached devices, things like that. Kind of a standard set of extra peripheral devices that I want to support. So I may say that I want a folder, I don't know, let's call it extras. Doesn't really matter what it's called. And I can import any drivers I want into that folder. So for x86, I have, for x86 Windows 7, I have one. For x86 Windows XP, I can create, same thing, extras. So I can create these folders to put these extra drivers into, and then modify the task sequence again. So let me create a selection profile. I could do it multiple ways. I could create a selection profile and select those extra folders, but it's just as easy to do it through the task sequence directly, so let's do it that way. Let's go back to the task sequence, edit it. We have driver group 001. Let me copy and paste. Now set driver group 002. In this case, I'll say extra. Let me move that down. Actually, I do want it to be 001 again. And let me copy the driver's step, paste that. Again, I can specify a selection profile of nothing. I can say inject all the drivers. So for the first one, it makes sense to install the model-specific drivers. For the second one, I'll just install the extra folder. So whatever drivers I drop into there, whether or not the device is detected or not, I'll inject it. So we talked about printer drivers and scanner drivers and maybe phone and iPad or iPod or anything else that you wanted to attach to the machine. The drivers go in there, they get injected into the Windows driver store. They're now available for whenever that device gets plugged in. So if it's not there at the time the deployment happens, that's okay. We'll still have the devices locally like that. So we can continue to add more of these steps into the task sequence to control what we want to do that's model specific, what we want to do that's more global, and we might then also have an extra one at the end that pretty much says we're going to create a third set of folders that's just plug and play chaos mode. So maybe we found in our environment that some people have gone out and bought some really high-end video cards. We're not going to test those out and build a model folder for that. We're just going to put another folder together and just dump those into there. We don't want to inject them onto every machine because they're too big. We can put them into this other folder and say auto apply if you find the plug and play IDs like that. So it's not unusual to end up with a task sequence that has 3, 4, 5, 6 different inject driver steps, each of which has different criteria associated with it to control what's used when. Okay.
Slides.
Let's switch back.
So everything that Michael has been talking about is also applicable for Config Manager. And I'm just curious, how many of you are actually using Config Manager today here? A good few of you. I would say 60% or so. So the question was, can I upgrade my RC1 to RTM? No, not Config Manager. Sorry. It's the opportunity to rebuild it again.
It's just in your lab environment, right? So it's not a big deal to rebuild your lab. I do it every week.
Exactly.
There's a question over here.
Yeah.
I use my 32-bit boot image for any architecture I'm deploying. Is there a benefit to using a 64-bit?
So the question was related to 32-bit boot images. I will answer that question in about 2 minutes. So just hold that thought, and I'll get back to it.
I'll address the light touch side before we get into the config manager side. With MDT 2010, you didn't have a choice. If you wanted to deploy an x64 OS, you needed to use an x64 boot image. If you wanted to deploy an x86 OS, you needed an x86 boot image. With MDT 2012, we changed that. So now you can use an x86 boot image to deploy x86 or x64 to match up with what config manager could already do. So at this point, it doesn't really matter. You can use an x86 boot image to do just about anything.
Are there any specific scenarios where you still have to use setup files to lay down the image?
So the follow-up question then was, are there any specific scenarios where you have to use the setup files to install the OS? That's getting deeper into the discussion. And it's more of an image engineering question than a driver management question, but we'll talk on it real quick. There are a couple of scenarios where that is necessary. In the case of MDT 2012, you would need to use setup files to install Windows Vista from the install.wim. But pretty much for any other scenario, you don't really need to do that. For the current MDT 2012 release, we still use setup by default, but if the setup files aren't there, we'll fall back to using ImageX. So you don't have to use the setup files anymore, but if you try to do that with Vista, it will fail. Windows 7, Windows 8 handle that okay. In the config manager case, it's a little more challenging just because of the way that it's handling the install.wim. So if you try the scenario and it works, but you end up with Windows running from d:\\Windows, well, that answers your question for you. In that case, you need to use the setup file so that Windows ends up on C.
All right. So for the config manager side, everything that Michael said is still applicable. They also have a repository of drivers. It's called the catalog. And when you import the drivers in there, you create packages. And then you have different methods of having config manager applying these packages for you. So basically, you can select whether to go total chaos or total control or any way in between. So if you just flip the slide for me, whatever you put it. The total chaos version, the plug-and-play ID detection version, is the default. It's called auto-apply, and that step you will find in the default sequence. The other way is called apply driver package, and that has changed how it works in config manager 012 compared with 07. There was actually a bug in 2007, which I used a lot. I called it a feature. I used to create apply driver packages and just associate them with model. I didn't even import them. I just created them and I deployed and life was good. Now in config manager 12, you are forced to import drivers. So you are now forced to also tag them to be able to have some way of identify the drivers that you then deploy. But there is a benefit of doing that. First of all, in config manager 12, we have a new content library. So all the packages, if you have a package with a driver that is the same in another package, it will only be stored once. So no duplication, no bigger driver packages. We'll actually see your driver repository about capped in half compared with 2007. And that means less to replicate between all your DPs, so that's good. And the validation, the import actually do something else. It validates that the driver is reasonably okay. A driver that doesn't even import is probably not a good driver. But in 07, you can actually create that driver package with that bad driver. You can try deploy it, and it will blow up. Now you get warned before it blows up. So it will take a bit longer time, yes, but it can be worked. So if you give me my number 3, please. So you might remember that in 07, it was quite common that you created folders in drivers. You can even create search folders. You can have ready-made folders for your models. Well, can't do that anymore. Search folders are gone. You can save searches. Yeah, that's the same with updates. That's the comment. But when you import drivers, when you right-click the drivers node and you need to click that node, you cannot create a folder and try to right-click that folder and say import drivers. You click the drivers node and you go import. And then you specify a folder where you have drivers. And I normally maintain my sort of total control freak folder style the way I always have. You know, OS and then models. Fine. That's just my own repository where I'm importing from into config manager. So I will simply select the folder that I have for one of the models. I will not pick it all because it will take some time to, I'll do the modem. And during the import, we can now tag the drivers. We can tag them with categories, like you did in 07. So as you can see here, I have tagged them with the name of the OS and the name of the model. And all this information is now searchable for me once I imported that into the console. And you can figure out any combination here. This is not the right way to do it. As long as you can find the driver after you import it, I don't care what you tag it with. Just make up something that works for you. So in this case, this was an 8560, so I will tag it with 8560. And hit OK. But I would like to highlight one thing. So I'll go back again. This one. This is new. This is how you can control what to do if the driver already exists. And the default option is actually the option I use the most. And that is, all right, if the driver is there and you assign a new category, tag that with that new category as well. Because sometimes I may have the same driver tagged with multiple options if I need to. But it's still good to be able to have that option. So I get the driver, import it, I specify a package where I want it, I skip the update for now, I don't need it for my boot image this time, and ahead I go. And it will import the driver, add it to the package shortly.
It still can extract it from cabs like NVC, right?
The comment was, can config manager extract from cab files? Well, yeah, it can, but I normally always extract everything into my source first and clean up a little bit, then I import, even if I technically could go for a cab file. Now, when I have my drivers, as you can see, they have all been tagged. And that means I can search for stuff. I can search for my 8560 thing. And it will return the list of all my 8560. Hello. I can type. This helps. And I can see all my drivers. And if I want to add additional drivers to a package, I can right-click one or more, and I can go add it, and I can assign it to packages. I can also add them to boot image directly here. So for example, if I search for WinPE, I have imported WinPE drivers as well that I can add to my boot image this way. So on the boot image itself, I can right-click, I can go Properties, I can go to the new drivers node, it was named WinPE in the past, and I can either add or remove drivers directly from here, one by one. But if I go from the repository, I can do multiple at the same time, which sort of makes sense. So I import my drivers, I tag them correctly in a way I like, and then I start to create these packages, either during import or after. So in this case, I have a few packages. I have 4 of them for Windows 7, I have 1 for Windows XP, and I maintain a separate package for XP storage for those of you who still deploys XP out there. So how do I add them? How do I make this work? Well, I go to my sequence, I edit it, I simply disable the default plug-and-play ID method, and then I go ahead and add the package itself. So I will select the package, 8510 compact. I will give it a reasonable name, 8510 compact, and I will set the condition. And I was doing a demo in San Francisco last week that was broadcasted live, and I was trying to use the new computer name class. Didn't exist. But you set a filter to identify this model. Of course, I should have the right filter. It was an 8560, wasn't it? Which one did I select? No, it was the 8510. All right, good. So I set my 8510 filter. So you can often figure out a way to identify a machine. And to tie back what Michael said, well, sometimes they are different. Lenovo's, this is their model, but they have a short version called product version, which is actually more what I like. So I use a different filter for that. I rather ask the computer product or ThinkPad T420. For Panasonic, I would probably do the product instead. So you can often find an identifier for a package to make sure that that package is only applied if you actually have that specific machine.
And that is a case where you could use the same model alias script that we talked about earlier, too. You could add that into a config manager task sequence to set a model alias variable and then put a task sequence variable condition on the same step.
And I would do the same thing for XP, but the rare exception, if you do storage, if you add a package for storage here, for the storage drivers, because config manager can do that, inject storage drivers missing. Light touch can too, but it's not supported. But I need to select the driver, and I need to specify the exact model I need to have injected. And when I do drivers like this for storage, I don't use a model anymore. I'm rather using another plug-and-play ID or WMI question. and that is I'm using PNP entity and the device ID. So I will only install this driver for this particular controller if that's found. And of course, this one will break if I tried it. Invalid query. Because when you specify device IDs that have backslash in them, you need to have them both. So you need to type in double. Otherwise, it won't find the device ID. But this is how we can use the same approach as Michael showed you in Light Touch to do the same thing with Config Manager. As long as you have imported the drivers and tagged them, you are off to go. I see we have a question, but we are just wrapping up. So if you won't mind coming up here afterwards, I'll be happy to take that question. So,
just one quick comment on the injecting mass storage drivers. That's an XP challenge that goes away once you move away from XP.
Yes.
And we are 2 days above 2 years away from XP end of support.
Yes.
So the sooner you can get away from that, the better off you'll be, because it is a headache still to be dealing with mass storage drivers in XP. As soon as you can get to Windows 7, all of those problems disappear. Okay, Server 2003 is still around for a little while longer beyond 2014, so you might still need to deal with that there, but hey, Server 2008 R2 and Server 2012 are very nice operating systems. Please upgrade.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have two final things, final words. Thank you.